The trading post bells chimed ominously in the desert wind as Margaret Maggie O'Sullivan stood defiantly in her father's office, her emerald dress torn at the hem from her latest escape attempt. Outside, the Arizona Territory stretched endlessly under the scorching sun of 1885, while inside, her father's rage filled the small room like smoke from a wildfire. "You've embarrassed this family for the last time," Patrick O'Sullivan growled, his Irish accent thick with fury. Through the window, a massive silhouette approached on horseback, a figure so imposing that even the hardened frontier traders stepped aside. What happened next would transform a spoiled merchant's daughter into something she never imagined possible, in ways that would shock everyone who thought they knew Margaret O'Sullivan. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The Arizona Territory in 1885 was no place for a woman with opinions, especially not one like Margaret O'Sullivan, who had already scandalized the entire settlement of Copper Ridge by refusing 3 marriage proposals in as many months. The morning sun cast long shadows across the dusty Main Street as Maggie stood in the general store her father had built from nothing, sorting through fabric samples with the kind of bored precision that suggested her mind was elsewhere entirely. At 22, Margaret was considered practically a spinster by frontier standards, though her beauty was undeniable. Auburn hair that caught fire in sunlight, green eyes that sparkled with intelligence and mischief, and a figure that made cowboys tip their hats and stumble over their words. But it was her spirit that truly set her apart, a fierce independence. That had been both her greatest asset and her father's greatest frustration since the day she'd learned to walk. Patrick O'Sullivan had arrived in Arizona Territory 15 years earlier with nothing but determination and a wagon full of goods. Through shrewd trading and relentless work, he'd built O'Sullivan's Trading Post into the most successful mercantile operation between Tucson and Phoenix. His success had earned him respect, influence, and enough wealth to provide his daughter with luxuries most frontier women could only dream of: fine dresses shipped from San Francisco, books from back east, and an education that included reading, writing, and mathematics. That education, Patrick was beginning to realize, might have been a mistake. "Margaret Ann O'Sullivan, you get down from that counter this instant," he barked as he entered the store to find his daughter perched on the wooden surface, reading a dime novel instead of attending to customers. "Mrs. Henderson has been waiting 5 minutes for someone to help her with those ribbons." Maggie glanced up from her book, a lurid tale about a woman disguised as a man who joined a cattle drive, and offered her father's customer a smile that was perfectly polite and completely insincere. "Mrs. Henderson knows where everything is located. She's been shopping here for 3 years. The middle-aged rancher's wife shifted uncomfortably, clearly caught between her desire for good service and her reluctance to get involved in another O'Sullivan family argument. These public displays had become increasingly common as Maggie's defiance grew bolder and Patrick's patience grew thinner. "That's not the point, and you know it," Patrick said, his voice carrying the kind of controlled anger that suggested a much larger confrontation was brewing. "This is a business, not a lending library for your entertainment." Maggie closed the book with deliberate slowness, marking her place with a ribbon before sliding down from the counter. Her movements were graceful but calculated to demonstrate that she was complying with his request as a favor rather than out of genuine respect for his authority. It was exactly the kind of subtle rebellion that had been driving him to distraction for months. "Of course, Father. Mrs. Henderson, what can I help you find today?" As Maggie assisted the customer with exaggerated courtesy, Patrick retreated to his office behind the main store, where ledger books and correspondence covered every surface. The trading post was thriving, but his personal life was becoming increasingly complicated by his daughter's refusal to accept the role society expected her to play. The source of their current conflict lay in the 3 marriage proposals Maggie had rejected over the past year. Each suitor had been carefully chosen by Patrick as suitable matches, men with steady incomes, good reputations, and the kind of solid character that would provide his daughter with security and respectability. Thomas Wright, the banker's son. From Phoenix. James Mitchell, who owned a successful ranch 30 miles south of Copper Ridge. Most recently, Samuel Davis, a lawyer from Tucson whose practice was flourishing as the territory moved toward statehood. All three men were educated, financially stable, and genuinely interested in marrying Margaret. All three had been sent away with polite but firm rejections that left no room for negotiation or hope. Maggie's reasons varied. Thomas was boring, James smelled like cattle. Samuel talked too much about his own importance, but the underlying message was always the same. She would not be married off like a piece of merchandise, no matter how advantageous the arrangement might be for her father's business interests. The latest incident had occurred just 2 weeks earlier, when Samuel Davis had arrived from Tucson with a formal proposal and what he clearly believed was an irresistible offer. He was prepared to provide Margaret with a house in town, domestic help, and an allowance generous enough to maintain her in considerable comfort. The engagement would be announced immediately, with a wedding plan for Christmas, a timeline that would allow both families to prepare for a celebration befitting their social positions. Margaret had listened to his proposal with perfect composure, asked several intelligent questions about his legal practice and future plans, and then delivered a rejection so thorough and devastating that Samuel had left Copper Ridge the same day, never to return. "Mr. Davis," she had said, her voice carrying the kind of sweet reasonableness that Patrick had learned to recognize as a warning sign, "your offer is very generous, and I'm sure you would make some woman a perfectly adequate husband. However, I have no desire to spend my life decorating your parlor and hosting dinner parties for your business associates. I suggest you look for a woman whose ambitions align more closely with your expectations." The rejection had been delivered in the main store, within hearing of several customers who had spread the story throughout Copper Ridge within hours. By evening, everyone in town knew that Patrick O'Sullivan's daughter had humiliated another perfectly good suitor, and the speculation about her future had reached new levels of scandalous interest. That evening, Patrick had attempted to reason with his daughter in the privacy of their home, a substantial adobe house behind the trading post that reflected his success and status in the community. The conversation had not gone well. "Margaret, you can't continue rejecting every man who shows interest in you," he had said, trying to keep his voice calm and paternal rather than authoritative. "You're 22 years old. Most women your age have been married for years and have children of their own. Most women my age didn't have fathers who made sure they could read and think for themselves," Maggie had replied, settling into the leather chair by the fireplace with the kind of casual confidence that suggested she was prepared for a lengthy debate. "You educated me, Father. You taught me to question things, to expect more from life than just survival. Don't blame me for learning those lessons too well." The accusation stung because it contained enough truth to be genuinely painful. Patrick had encouraged his daughter's education, partly because he was proud of her intelligence and partly because he believed it would make her a more interesting and capable wife for whatever man eventually won her hand. He hadn't anticipated that education would lead her to question the fundamental assumptions about women's roles that governed frontier society. Education was meant to make you a better wife and mother, not to fill your head with impossible dreams about independence, he had argued. "This isn't Boston or New York, Margaret. This is Arizona territory. Women here need protection, stability, security. They need husbands who can provide for them and defend them. I don't need protection from anything except a boring marriage." To a man who thinks my highest aspiration should be managing his household, Maggie had shot back. "I can read, write, keep books, manage inventory, and handle customers as well as any man in this territory. Why should I give up my autonomy to Become some man's domestic servant? The argument had continued past midnight, with both father and daughter becoming increasingly entrenched in their positions. Patrick insisted that marriage was not servitude but partnership, that a good husband would value and protect his wife, while providing her with the security and respectability that single women could never achieve. Maggie countered that partnership required equality, and none of her suitors had shown the slightest interest in treating her as an equal rather than an acquisition. The conversation had ended in stalemate, with Patrick retreating to his study, and Maggie to her room, both frustrated by their inability to find common ground. But the underlying tension had continued to build over the following days, manifesting in small acts of rebellion that pushed the boundaries of acceptable behavior further each time. Maggie had started wearing pants when working in the storage areas, claiming they were more practical than skirts for lifting heavy boxes. She had begun reading aloud from her dime novels during slow periods, entertaining customers with stories about women who disguised themselves as men to seek adventure in the wider world. Most provocatively, she had started engaging male customers in conversations about politics, business, and current events, topics that most men found uncomfortable when discussed with women, especially unmarried women who expressed opinions with confidence and authority. The breaking point had come 3 days earlier, when Maggie had prevented what might have been a serious confrontation between two drunk cowboys who were arguing over a poker game in the saloon next to the trading post. Instead of seeking help from the sheriff or her father, she had walked into the saloon alone, positioned herself between the two men, and talked them into settling their dispute with words rather than violence. Her intervention had been successful. Cowboys had sobered up enough to realize they were making fools of themselves in front of a lady, and the potential fight had dissolved into embarrassed apologies and mutual respect. But Maggie's presence in the saloon, even briefly, had scandalized the town's respectable citizens and provided ammunition for those who had already been whispering about Patrick O'Sullivan's inability to control his daughter. She was in Murphy's saloon, Patrick, Mrs. Henderson had informed him the following morning, her voice carrying the kind of horrified fascination that suggested she found the scandal both shocking and secretly thrilling. In broad daylight, talking to those cowboys, like she was one of the boys. People are starting to wonder if you've lost all authority over that girl. The criticism had cut deeply because Patrick knew it contained truth. He was losing authority over Margaret, not through weakness or neglect, but because she had grown into a woman whose strength of will matched his own. The qualities that made her remarkable, her intelligence, her courage, her refusal to accept limitations, were the same qualities that made her unsuitable for the conventional life he wanted her to embrace. That morning, as Patrick watched his daughter help Mrs. Henderson with theatrical politeness while clearly resenting every moment of the interaction, he realized that their conflict had reached a point where compromise was no longer possible. Margaret would either accept the role society expected her to play, or she would continue pushing boundaries until she destroyed both her own reputation and his standing in the community. The decision he was contemplating would have seemed impossible a year earlier. Patrick loved his daughter deeply and had always been proud of her spirit and intelligence. But that same spirit was now threatening everything he had worked to build, and his position as a respected businessman and community leader required him to maintain some semblance of control over his own household. The solution, when it came to him, was as radical as it was desperate. If Margaret refused to accept marriage to a civilized man, perhaps she needed to understand exactly what the alternatives looked like. The Apache raids that had terrorized the territory for decades had largely ended, but individual bands still traded at frontier posts, and their presence remained a source of fascination and fear for most settlers. Patrick had done business with several Apache traders over the years, finding them honest in their dealings and more reliable than many white customers. Among them was a man known as Standing Bear, whose imposing physical presence and quiet dignity had earned him respect even from those who generally viewed Indians with suspicion and hostility. Standing Bear was not typical of the Apache traders who visited Copper Ridge. At nearly 7 feet tall, with shoulders that seemed broad enough to block out the sun, he was a figure of almost mythical proportions. His presence was so commanding that conversations stopped when he entered a room, and even hardened frontiersmen found themselves speaking more quietly in his vicinity. But it was not just his size that set Standing Bear apart. There was an intelligence in his dark eyes and a careful precision in his English that suggested education and experience far beyond what most people expected from an Apache warrior. He conducted business with the kind of patient dignity that commanded respect, never hurrying negotiations or accepting less than fair value for his goods, but never creating conflict or showing disrespect for the customs of the trading post. Patrick's interactions with Standing Bear had always been professional and mutually beneficial. The Apache brought high-quality hides, intricate beadwork, and occasionally silver jewelry that sold quickly to customers who valued authentic Indian craftsmanship. In return, he purchased practical goods, tools, ammunition, fabric, and supplies that he transported back to his people, somewhere in the mountainous regions north of Copper Ridge. Their conversations had gradually revealed that Standing Bear was not just a trader but a leader among his people, responsible for maintaining relationships with white settlements and ensuring that his band could obtain necessary supplies without resorting to raiding or violence. It was a difficult position that required diplomatic skills as well as physical courage, and Patrick had come to respect the man's intelligence and integrity. The idea that had begun forming in Patrick's mind was desperate enough to border on madness, but it addressed his fundamental problem in a way that conventional solutions could not. If Margaret refused to appreciate the security and respectability that marriage to a civilized man could provide, perhaps she needed to understand what life looked like without those protections. Standing Bear's next trading visit was scheduled for the end of the week. Patrick had 3 days to decide whether he was desperate enough to implement a plan that would either shock his daughter into accepting reality or destroy their relationship forever. As he watched Margaret continue her performance of grudging compliance with Mrs. Henderson's requests, Patrick O'Sullivan began to plan the most radical gamble of his life, one that would test whether his daughter's spirit was strong enough to survive in a world that offered no compromises and no second chances. The decision would change everything for both of them in ways that neither could possibly anticipate. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Standing Bear arrived in Copper Ridge exactly when Patrick expected him, just as the morning sun crested the mountains and painted the desert in shades of gold and crimson. His approach was unmistakable, a solitary figure on horseback whose very presence seemed to alter the atmosphere of the settlement. Even from a distance, his imposing stature was evident, and by the time he reached the main street, most of the town's residents had found reasons to peer through windows or step onto porches. Patrick watched from behind the trading post's front counter as the Apache warrior dismounted with fluid grace despite his massive frame. Standing Bear moved with the kind of controlled power that reminded observers of a mountain cat, deceptively calm but capable of explosive action. His long black hair was braided with silver ornaments that caught the light, and his clothing combined traditional Apache elements with practical frontier gear in a way that suggested someone who navigated between two worlds with equal confidence. "Father, your Apache friend has arrived," Margaret called from the storage room, her tone carefully neutral. She had learned over the years to hide her fascination with Standing Bear behind a mask of polite disinterest, but Patrick had noticed how she always found reasons to be present during his trading visits. Whether this interest stemmed from curiosity about Apache culture or something more personal, Patrick had never been entirely certain. What he did know was that Standing Bear treated his daughter with a respectful courtesy, That was notably different from his interactions with other women in Copper Ridge. The Apache warrior seemed to recognize Margaret's intelligence and independence, engaging her in conversations about books, current events, and even business matters with a seriousness that most men reserved exclusively for other men. These interactions had always made Patrick slightly uncomfortable, not because he doubted Standing Bear's honorable intentions, but because they highlighted the contrast between the Apache's treatment of his daughter and the expectations of the white men who had courted her. Where her rejected suitors had seen Margaret's education and opinions as obstacles to overcome or problems to solve, Standing Bear seemed to view them as natural expressions of her character. The trading session began with the same ritual courtesy that had characterized all of Standing Bear's visits. He unpacked his goods with careful precision, laying out beautifully crafted items that represented hours of skilled labor. Beaded moccasins that seemed almost too beautiful to wear, silver jewelry that captured the play of desert light, and blankets woven with patterns that told stories of Apache history and tradition. Patrick examined each item with the professional eye of an experienced trader, but his mind was focused on the conversation he planned to initiate once the business aspects were concluded. The plan he had conceived was so radical that he had spent the past 3 days alternating between determination and doubt, wondering if desperation had driven him beyond the boundaries of reasonable parental authority. Margaret assisted with the trading session as she always did, recording transactions in the ledger book and helping to examine the quality of various items. Her interactions with Standing Bear were marked by the same mutual respect that Patrick had observed during previous visits. But today he noticed something else, a kind of electric awareness that seemed to pass between them when their hands briefly touched while examining a piece of silver jewelry. The moment was so subtle that anyone else might have missed it, but Patrick's attention was focused on reading the dynamics between his daughter and the Apache warrior. What he saw confirmed his suspicions that Margaret's interest in Standing Bear went beyond simple curiosity about Apache culture. There was an attraction there, carefully hidden but unmistakably real. "Mr. O'Sullivan," Standing Bear said as they concluded the formal trading session, "you seem troubled today. Is there something beyond business that you wish to discuss?" The observation was delivered with the kind of quiet perception that Patrick had learned to expect from the Apache warrior. Standing Bear possessed an almost supernatural ability to read people and situations, a skill that had undoubtedly contributed to his survival and success as both a warrior and a diplomat. Patrick glanced around the store, noting that Margaret was busy with inventory and the other customers had departed. The timing was as perfect as he was likely to get for the conversation that would either solve his problems or create new ones, far more serious than anything he currently faced. "Actually, yes. There is something I'd like to discuss with you privately, if you have time." Standing Bear nodded gravely and followed Patrick into the office behind the main store. The space was cramped for 2 grown men, especially when one of them was nearly 7 feet tall, but the Apache warrior settled into a chair with the same fluid grace that characterized all his movements. "You honor me with your confidence," Standing Bear said, his English formal but perfectly clear. "How may I be of service?" Patrick found himself struggling to begin a conversation that would have seemed impossible just a week earlier. How did a man explain to an Apache warrior that he was so desperate to control his daughter's future that he was willing to consider the most radical solution imaginable? "It concerns my daughter Margaret," Patrick began carefully. "I believe you've noticed that she's different from most young women in this territory." Standing Bear's expression remained neutral, but something in his dark eyes suggested increased attention. "Miss Margaret is indeed remarkable. She possesses qualities that are highly valued among my people: intelligence, courage, and the strength to speak her own thoughts. You should be proud of such a daughter." The compliment was sincere and perceptive, but it also highlighted the central problem that had brought Patrick to this desperate point. Those same qualities that you admire have made it impossible for her to accept the kind of life that's expected of women in our society. She's rejected 3 marriage proposals from suitable men, and her behavior is becoming increasingly scandalous by the standards of this community. Standing Bear listened without interruption as Patrick explained the mounting pressure from town leaders, the damage to his own reputation, and Margaret's stubborn refusal to consider any of the conventional solutions to her unmarried status. The Apache warrior's expression remained thoughtful throughout the recitation, but Patrick could see that he was processing not just the words, but their deeper implications. You speak of your daughter as if she were a wild horse that needs to be broken, Standing Bear observed when Patrick had finished. But perhaps the problem is not with the horse, but with those who seek to ride it without understanding its true nature. The metaphor was apt and uncomfortably accurate. Patrick had indeed been trying to force Margaret into a mold that didn't fit her essential character, hoping that enough pressure would eventually make her conform to social expectations that felt increasingly artificial and constraining. That may be true, Patrick admitted, but the reality is that she cannot continue living as she does without destroying both her future and mine. The town leaders are beginning to question my authority and my fitness to serve in positions of responsibility if I cannot manage my own household. And so you seek a different kind of solution, Standing Bear said, his tone suggesting that he had already guessed the direction of Patrick's thoughts. This was the moment that would either open new possibilities or end their relationship entirely. Patrick took a deep breath and committed himself to a course of action that felt like jumping off a cliff in the hope that he could learn to fly before hitting the ground. Among your people, are there customs that address situations where a young woman cannot find a suitable place in traditional society? Standing Bear was quiet for a long moment, studying Patrick's face with the kind of intense attention that suggested he was evaluating not just the question but the man asking it. When he finally spoke, his words were carefully chosen and weighted with significance. Among the Apache, a woman's value is not determined solely by her willingness to accept the role that others choose for her. We have traditions that recognize different kinds of strength and different paths to honor and respect. The conversation continued for nearly an hour, with both men speaking carefully around the radical proposition that was taking shape between them. Standing Bear explained Apache customs regarding marriage, adoption, and the integration of outsiders into tribal life. Patrick described his growing desperation and his willingness to consider solutions that would have been unthinkable under normal circumstances. What emerged from their discussion was not a formal agreement, but an understanding of possibilities that neither man would have imagined exploring just days earlier. Standing Bear would not take Margaret against her will. Such an action would violate both Apache customs and his personal code of honor. But if she chose to come with him, to experience life among his people and learn what alternatives existed to the constraining expectations of frontier society, he would accept responsibility for her safety and welfare. The arrangement they discussed was unprecedented and potentially scandalous, but it addressed Patrick's fundamental problem while respecting Margaret's autonomy in ways that her rejected suitors never had. If she continued to refuse conventional marriage and conventional behavior, she would have the opportunity to discover what other kinds of life were possible for a woman of her character and capabilities. This is not a decision to be made lightly, Standing Bear warned as their conversation drew toward a conclusion. Life among my people would be very different from what Miss Margaret has known. There would be hardships, challenges, and responsibilities that she has never faced. She would need to prove herself in ways that frontier society has never required. But she would have the chance to prove herself, Patrick replied, rather than simply accepting limitations imposed by others' expectations. When they returned to the main store, Margaret was waiting with the kind of alert attention that suggested she had been aware of their extended private conversation. Her green eyes moved between her father and Standing Bear with the analytical precision of someone trying to solve a puzzle with insufficient information. "Did you conclude your business satisfactorily?" she asked, her tone carrying undertones that suggested she suspected their discussion had involved more than routine trading matters. Standing Bear looked directly at her for the first time since their conversation had begun, and Patrick could see something pass between them, a moment of recognition and possibility that confirmed his suspicions about the mutual attraction he had observed. "We discussed several possibilities that may prove beneficial to all concerned," Standing Bear replied, his formal language not quite concealing the deeper meanings embedded in his words. "But such possibilities require careful consideration and cannot be decided hastily." Margaret's expression sharpened with interest, and Patrick realized that his daughter's intelligence had grasped the implications of their mysterious conversation far more quickly than he had anticipated. She looked between the two men with growing understanding, and he could see her mind working to piece together the fragments of information available to her. "What kind of possibilities?" she asked directly, abandoning any pretense of polite disinterest. Question hung in the air between them, loaded with significance that would determine the future course of all their lives. Patrick found himself at the point of no return, faced with the choice between revealing his desperate gamble or retreating to the safety of conventional solutions that had already proven inadequate. Standing Bear watched both father and daughter with the patient attention of someone who understood that the next few moments would shape decisions that could not be undone. His presence filled the small store with a sense of momentous possibility, as if the very air had become charged with the potential for transformation. Margaret stepped closer to both men, her chin raised with the defiant courage that had characterized her entire adult life. Whatever they were discussing, she was clearly prepared to face it head-on rather than being protected from difficult truths or challenging choices. "Father," she said, her voice carrying the kind of steel-edged determination that had made 3 suitors retreat in defeat, "I think it's time you told me exactly what you and Standing Bear have been discussing. And don't insult my intelligence by pretending it was about trading goods." The moment of truth had arrived, and Patrick O'Sullivan realized that his desperate gamble was about to be revealed to the one person whose reaction would determine whether it was the solution to his problems or the beginning of something far more complicated and dangerous than anything he had yet faced. Standing Bear remained motionless, waiting for Patrick to make the choice that would either honor his daughter's right to know her own future or continue the pattern of making decisions about her life without her input. The silence stretched between them, heavy with unspoken possibilities and the weight of decisions that would reshape all their lives in ways none of them could fully anticipate. The words hit Margaret like a thunderbolt. Her father was essentially offering to give her away to an Apache warrior rather than continue dealing with her refusal to marry within their own society. For a moment, the absurdity of the situation rendered her speechless. Here was Patrick O'Sullivan, respected businessman and pillar of the Copper Ridge community, proposing the most scandalous solution imaginable to his daughter's unmarried status. "You want to trade me to Standing Bear like a bolt of fabric or a bag of flour?" Margaret's voice was dangerously quiet, the kind of controlled tone that had preceded her most devastating rejections of previous suitors. "It's not trading," Patrick said quickly, recognizing the warning signs of his daughter's legendary temper. "It's offering you an opportunity to experience a different way of life, one where your unique qualities might be valued rather than seen as problems to be solved." Margaret turned her full attention to Standing Bear, studying his face with the analytical intensity she usually reserved for complex business calculations. "And you agreed to this arrangement to take on the burden of a white woman who's too stubborn to accept her proper place in society?" Standing Bear's response carried a dignity that transformed the entire conversation. "I agreed to offer sanctuary to a woman of exceptional courage who deserves the chance to discover what she might become when freed from limitations that do not honor her true nature." The words were spoken with such sincere respect that Margaret felt her anger falter. This was not the casual dismissal she had expected, not the patronizing attitude that had characterized every interaction with her rejected suitors. Standing Bear was speaking to her as an equal, acknowledging her worth in terms she had never heard from any man in Copper Ridge. What exactly would this sanctuary involve? She asked, her voice betraying curiosity despite her attempt to maintain indignant composure. Before either man could answer, the store's bell chimed with the arrival of Mrs. Catherine Whitman, the town's most notorious gossip and self-appointed guardian of moral standards. Her timing was catastrophic. She entered just as the conversation reached its most delicate point, her sharp eyes immediately noting the unusual tension between the three people near the counter. "Good afternoon, Patrick, Margaret," Mrs. Whitman said with false sweetness, her gaze lingering on Standing Bear with the kind of suspicious interest that suggested she sensed scandal in the air. "I hope I'm not interrupting important business." "Not at all, Mrs. Whitman," Patrick replied with forced cheerfulness. "Standing Bear and I were just concluding our trading session." But Mrs. Whitman was not easily dismissed. She had built her reputation on ferreting out interesting information, and the electric tension in the room promised rewards worth pursuing. She began examining merchandise with exaggerated interest, while clearly listening for any revealing details. Margaret recognized the danger immediately. If Mrs. Whitman overheard even fragments of their conversation, the scandal would spread through Copper Ridge within hours, destroying any possibility of keeping their radical arrangement private until decisions were made. "Father," Margaret said, with sudden brightness, "why don't you and Standing Bear continue your discussion in the office while I help Mrs. Whitman find what she needs?" The suggestion was clearly a tactical maneuver to remove sensitive conversation from prying ears, but it also demonstrated Margaret's quick thinking under pressure. Exactly the kind of intelligence that Standing Bear had praised and her suitors had found troublesome. In the cramped office, Patrick and Standing Bear could hear Margaret's voice through the thin walls as she engaged Mrs. Whitman in animated conversation about fabric choices and seasonal merchandise. Her performance was masterful, providing enough interesting gossip about other families to distract the woman from her original curiosity about the Apache warriors' extended visit. "Your daughter possesses remarkable diplomatic skills," Standing Bear observed quietly. "Such abilities would be highly valued among my people, where maintaining relationships between different groups often determines survival." Patrick nodded, recognizing that Margaret's quick-thinking response to Mrs. Whitman's intrusion was exactly the kind of practical intelligence that made her unsuitable for the passive role expected of frontier wives, but potentially perfect for the challenges of Apache life. "If she agrees to come with you," Patrick said, finally voicing the question that had been haunting him since their conversation began, "what would her actual position be among your people? Would she be your wife?" The directness of the question forced both men to confront implications that had been circling around the edges of their discussion. Standing Bear's interest in Margaret clearly extended beyond cultural exchange or charitable assistance, but the exact nature of his intentions remained undefined. "Among the Apache," Standing Bear replied carefully, "respect and position must be earned through demonstrated worth. Miss Margaret would have opportunities to prove herself according to our standards, but she would also have the freedom to choose her own path based on what she discovered about herself and our way of life." The answer was diplomatically vague, but Patrick could read between the lines. Standing Bear was attracted to Margaret and would welcome the opportunity to court her according to Apache customs, but he was also committed to allowing her genuine choice in determining her own future. It was exactly the combination of personal interest and respectful autonomy that Margaret had never encountered among her white suitors. Mrs. Whitman's departure after purchasing an unnecessary quantity of ribbon was marked by lingering glances and pointed comments about the unusual length of Standing Bear's visit. Her parting words carried barely concealed threats about the importance of maintaining proper standards in business relationships. I do hope, Patrick, that you're careful about the kind of associations you maintain. The town council takes such matters seriously when considering positions of community leadership. After she left, Margaret rejoined her father and Standing Bear in the main store, her expression revealing that she had overheard enough of Mrs. Whitman's commentary to understand the political pressures driving her father's desperate proposal. So, she said with characteristic directness, Mrs. Whitman's visit just demonstrated exactly why you feel compelled to find a radical solution to my unmarried status. The town's moral guardians are watching for any excuse to question your fitness for community leadership. It's not just about my position, Patrick protested, though they all knew that his business and social standing were significant factors. In the crisis, it's about your future, Margaret. You can't continue rejecting every conventional opportunity without eventually facing consequences that I can't protect you from. Margaret walked to the store's front window, looking out at the dusty street where afternoon shadows were beginning to lengthen. Copper Ridge stretched before her in all its familiar limitations, the same faces, the same expectations, the same narrow definitions of what a woman could be or accomplish. Standing Bear, she said without turning from the window, if I were to accept this opportunity, what would happen to me if I couldn't adapt to Apache life? What if I proved unsuitable for your people's way of living? The question revealed that she was seriously considering the proposal, but it also demonstrated her practical nature. Margaret had always been someone who calculated risks before making decisions, and this choice involved higher stakes than anything she had previously faced. You would be free to return here whenever you chose, Standing Bear replied. My protection would extend to ensuring your safe passage back to Copper Ridge if you decided that our way of life was not suitable for you. And if I stayed? If I found that I could adapt and contribute to your community? The second question carried deeper implications, and all three of them understood that they were discussing possibilities that could fundamentally alter the course of Margaret's life. Standing Bear's answer would determine whether this radical experiment remained a temporary escape or opened the door to permanent transformation. If you chose to remain among my people, Standing Bear said, his voice carrying new warmth, you would have earned that choice through your own efforts and proven worth. You would belong not because someone decided your fate, but because you had demonstrated your value according to our standards. Margaret was quiet for several minutes, her gaze fixed on the mountains that rose beyond Copper Ridge's modest collection of buildings. Somewhere in those distant peaks lay Standing Bear's people, living according to customs and expectations entirely different from everything she had known. How long would I have to decide? She asked finally. I will remain in this area for 2 more days, Standing Bear replied. If you choose to come with me, we would leave when I depart for my people's winter camp. 2 days to decide whether to abandon everything familiar for an uncertain future among people whose language she didn't speak and whose customs she barely understood. The timeline seemed impossibly short for such a momentous choice, yet Margaret found herself energized rather than overwhelmed by the compressed decision period. Father, she said, turning back to face both men, I need complete honesty from you. Is this proposal motivated by love and concern for my future, or by frustration and a desire to teach me a lesson about the value of conventional security? Patrick had been dreading this question because it forced him to examine his own motives with uncomfortable precision. Was he offering his daughter freedom, or was he punishing her for refusing to conform to his expectations? Both, he admitted finally. I am frustrated by your refusal to accept any of the good matches I've arranged, and I am concerned about the consequences of your continued defiance of social expectations. But I'm also beginning to understand that trying to force you into a conventional role might be destroying something remarkable about who you are. The honesty was painful but necessary. Margaret had always been able to detect insincerity, and this moment required complete truthfulness if they were to move forward with any possibility of maintaining their relationship. "And you, Standing Bear," Margaret continued, "what is your motivation for making this offer? Charity toward a misfit white woman? Cultural curiosity? Or something more personal?" The directness of her question would have shocked most men in Copper Ridge, but Standing Bear met her gaze with equal frankness. "My people would benefit from someone with your skills and intelligence. But I would be dishonest if I claimed that my interest was purely practical. I have observed you during my visits here, and I have seen qualities that I greatly admire." The admission hung in the air between them, transforming the conversation from abstract possibility to personal invitation. Margaret felt something stir. In her chest a mixture of excitement, fear, and recognition that this might be the opportunity she had been unconsciously seeking through all her rejections of conventional suitors that evening. As Margaret sat in her room, reviewing the impossible choice she faced, she realized that Standing Bear's proposal offered something none of her white suitors had ever provided: the chance to discover what she might become rather than simply accepting what others expected her to be. The decision would determine not just her immediate future, but the entire trajectory of her life. In 2 days, she would either remain Margaret O'Sullivan, the unmarried daughter who scandalized Copper Ridge with her independence, or she would become something entirely new among people who might value her strength rather than viewing it as a problem to be solved. The choice was terrifying and exhilarating in equal measure, and for the first time in her adult life, Margaret felt that she was facing a decision that truly honored both her courage and her intelligence. Margaret barely slept that first night, her mind churning through possibilities and consequences until the pre-dawn hours, when exhaustion finally claimed her. She woke to the sound of her father moving around downstairs, preparing for another day of pretending that everything was normal, while they both knew that nothing would ever be the same again. The morning brought an unexpected complication in the form of Reverend Joshua Matthews, who arrived at the trading post before they had even opened for business. The minister was a stern man in his 40s who took his role as guardian of community morality very seriously, and his unscheduled visit suggested that Mrs. Whitman had wasted no time in sharing her suspicions about yesterday's mysterious conversation. "Patrick," Reverend Matthews said without preamble, "I've received some concerning reports about your interactions with that Apache trader. Several members of my congregation are worried about the nature of your business relationship with such people." Margaret watched from the top of the stairs as her father handled the minister's barely concealed accusations with diplomatic skill. Patrick had clearly anticipated this kind of scrutiny and prepared responses that satisfied immediate concerns without revealing the true nature of yesterday's discussion. "Standing Bear has been trading here for 3 years, Reverend," Patrick replied calmly. "His conduct has always been honorable, and his business brings valuable goods to our community. I see no reason to change that relationship based on unfounded suspicions." "It's not his trading that concerns me," Reverend Matthews continued, "but the amount of time he spent here yesterday and the reports of intense private conversations. Mrs. Whitman mentioned that your daughter seemed unusually involved in whatever discussions were taking place." The minister's words carried unmistakable implications about Margaret's reputation and behavior. If rumors began circulating about inappropriate interactions with an Apache warrior, her already precarious social position would become completely untenable. Margaret descended the stairs with deliberate calm, knowing that her response to the minister's concerns would either diffuse the immediate crisis or create new problems that could complicate her decision-making process. "Reverend Matthews," she said with perfect courtesy, "I assisted with the trading session as I always do, recording transactions and evaluating merchandise. If my presence during business discussion seems unusual to some people, Perhaps they should consider whether their own wives and daughters might benefit from learning useful skills rather than limiting themselves to purely decorative roles. The response was calculated to shift attention away from her specific interactions with Standing Bear, while subtly challenging the minister's assumptions about women's proper activities. It was exactly the kind of deflection that had made Margaret's reputation for difficult behavior, but it also demonstrated the quick thinking that Standing Bear had identified as valuable to Apache society. Reverend Matthews frowned at her boldness, but couldn't find fault with her explanation without appearing to criticize women's participation in legitimate business activities. He departed with warnings about the importance of maintaining proper standards and avoiding any associations that might cause scandal, but his immediate concerns had been addressed. "That was skillfully handled," Patrick observed after the minister left, "but it won't be the last time we face such questions. If you're seriously considering Standing Bear's proposal, we need to be extremely careful about how we manage the next 2 days." Margaret nodded, understanding that her father was right about the need for discretion. Any hint of the radical arrangement they were contemplating would create a scandal that could destroy Patrick's business and make her return impossible if she eventually chose to come back to Copper Ridge. "I want to speak with Standing Bear privately," Margaret said, her decision surprising even herself. "Not here, where every conversation might be overheard and misinterpreted, but somewhere we can discuss what his proposal actually involves without worrying about who might be listening." Patrick looked troubled by the idea of his daughter meeting alone with an Apache warrior, but he also recognized that she needed complete information to make such a momentous decision. After some discussion, they agreed that Margaret would ride out to the springs north of town where Standing Bear was camped, ostensibly to deliver supplies he had purchased but forgotten to take with him. The excuse was plausible enough to deflect immediate suspicion while providing Margaret with the privacy she needed for honest conversation about her potential future among the Apache. But Patrick insisted on conditions that would protect both her safety and her reputation. She would make the ride during daylight hours, return before evening, and carry her father's rifle as both protection and symbol of her family's trust. In Standing Bear's honorable intentions, Margaret had always been an accomplished rider, having learned to handle horses as soon as she was old enough to reach the stirrups. The 10-mile journey to the springs took her through terrain that showcased the stark beauty of Arizona Territory, rolling hills dotted with mesquite and palo verde trees, distant mountains that shimmered in the desert heat, and expanses of open country that seemed to stretch forever under the endless blue sky. The landscape felt different today, charged with possibility and promise in ways she had never noticed before. Every mile away from Copper Ridge seemed to expand her horizons, offering glimpses of freedom that made her current life feel increasingly constraining. She found Standing Bear's camp beside a natural spring that created a small oasis of green vegetation in the desert landscape. His temporary shelter was constructed with materials that would leave no permanent mark on the land, and his horses grazed peacefully in the shade of ancient cottonwood trees. The entire scene had a quality of harmony with the natural environment that contrasted sharply with Copper Ridge's more invasive approach to frontier settlement. Standing Bear emerged from his shelter as she approached, his movements fluid and alert, but showing no surprise at her arrival. His ability to detect her approach long before she reached his camp reminded Margaret that she was dealing with someone whose survival had depended on skills she could barely comprehend. "Miss Margaret," he said with formal courtesy, "you honor me with your visit. I assume you have questions about what life among my people would involve." "I have many questions," Margaret replied, dismounting and accepting his gesture toward comfortable seat on a blanket near the spring. "But my most important question is whether you're offering me this opportunity because you believe I could genuinely contribute to your community, or because you feel some kind of personal obligation to rescue a woman who can't find her proper place in white society." The directness of her question would have startled most men, But Standing Bear met her gaze with the same uncompromising honesty she was demanding from him. Both motivations are present, he admitted, but the second is less important than the first. My people face challenges that require intelligence, adaptability, and the kind of independent thinking that your society discourages in women. These qualities are not problems to be solved among the Apache, they are resources to be valued and developed. What specific challenges? Margaret asked, settling onto the blanket with the practical grace that had always set her apart from more conventionally feminine women. Standing Bear's answer revealed depths of complexity in Apache society that she had never imagined. His people were navigating the transition from traditional ways of life to the realities of reduced territory and increased contact with white settlements. They needed individuals who could serve as bridges between cultures, who could understand both Apache customs and American legal and business practices. The old ways served us well when we controlled vast territories and could move freely according to seasonal patterns, Standing Bear explained. But now we must learn to prosper within defined boundaries, to trade effectively with white communities, and to protect our interests through negotiation rather than warfare. Margaret listened with growing fascination as he described a society that was simultaneously maintaining ancient traditions and adapting to rapidly changing circumstances. The challenges he outlined required exactly the kind of skills she had developed at her father's trading post, the ability to manage complex relationships, to understand both cultural differences and practical necessities, and to find creative solutions to unprecedented problems. Your skills with numbers, writing, and record-keeping would be immediately valuable, Standing Bear continued. But more importantly, your ability to think independently and question established patterns would help us develop new approaches to the challenges we face. And what would be expected of me personally? What would my daily life look like? The question forced them to move beyond abstract discussions of cultural exchange to the practical realities of what Margaret's choice would actually involve. Standing Bear's response painted a picture of life that was both more demanding and more rewarding than anything she had experienced in Copper Ridge. Initially, you would live among the women of my extended family, learning our language and customs while contributing according to your abilities. You would not be expected to abandon your own identity, but you would need to demonstrate respect for our ways and willingness to adapt to circumstances very different from what you have known. And if I proved unable to adapt, if the cultural differences proved too great to overcome, then you would return to your father with honor, having attempted something that required great courage. But I do not believe you would fail, Miss Margaret. I have observed your character for 3 years, and I have seen qualities that would be highly valued among my people. The conversation continued through the afternoon, with Standing Bear describing Apache customs, challenges, and opportunities in detail that revealed both the difficulties and rewards Margaret might face. His honesty about the hardships was balanced by genuine enthusiasm for the contributions she could make, creating a picture of potential life that was both realistic and inspiring. As the day grew later, Margaret found herself increasingly drawn to the possibility Standing Bear was offering. Not just escape from the constraints of frontier society, but the chance to discover what she might become when her intelligence and independence were viewed as assets rather than problems. There's something else I need to know, Margaret said, as the time came for her to return to Copper Ridge. Your interest in offering me this opportunity, is it purely practical? Or is there a personal element that I should understand before making my decision? Standing Bear was quiet for a long moment, studying her face with the intense attention she had learned to recognize as his way of weighing important words before speaking them. Among my people, he said finally, a man and woman must choose each other freely, based on mutual respect and demonstrated compatibility. I would be honored if our association developed in that direction, but such a choice would be yours to make after you had learned our ways and decided whether our life suited your nature. The admission was both more and less than Margaret had expected. Standing there was acknowledging attraction and interest, but he was also making clear that any personal relationship would have to develop naturally rather than being imposed as a condition of her acceptance into Apache society. So I would have genuine choice about my personal relationships as well as my role in the community. Complete choice, earned through your own efforts and based on your own preferences. That is the Apache way. As Margaret rode back to Copper Ridge in the gathering dusk, she carried with her a vision of possibility that transformed her understanding of what life might offer. Standing Bear's proposal wasn't just about escaping the limitations of frontier society, it was about discovering what she could become when her strength was valued rather than constrained. The decision she faced was no longer simply about rejecting an unsatisfying present, but about embracing a future that honored her true nature while challenging her to grow in ways she had never imagined possible. The question now was whether she possessed the courage to seize such an extraordinary opportunity, knowing that it would require abandoning everything familiar for something entirely unknown. Margaret returned to Copper Ridge just as the evening shadows were painting the desert in shades of purple and gold, her mind churning with everything Standing Bear had revealed about life among his people. The vision he had painted was both thrilling and terrifying, a world where her intelligence would be valued, her independence respected, but where she would also face challenges unlike anything she had ever encountered. She found her father waiting anxiously in the trading post, his relief at her safe return evident in the way his shoulders relaxed when she walked through the door. But Patrick's expression quickly shifted to concern as he studied his daughter's face, recognizing the telltale signs that indicated she was processing momentous decisions. "How did your conversation go?" he asked carefully, knowing that her answer might determine the entire future course of their family. "It was enlightening," Margaret replied, settling into the chair behind the counter with the kind of deliberate calm that suggested she was still organizing her thoughts. "Standing Bear's people face challenges that I never understood, and they need skills that I actually possess. It's not charity he's offering, Father. It's genuine partnership." The word partnership hung in the air between them, carrying implications that both father and daughter understood, but weren't quite ready to examine fully. Patrick could see in Margaret's expression that Standing Bear's proposal had evolved beyond simple cultural exchange into something that might reshape her entire life. Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Samuel Davis, the lawyer from Tucson, whose marriage proposal Margaret had rejected so thoroughly just weeks earlier. His unexpected return to Copper Ridge suggested either renewed romantic hopes or business concerns that had brought him back despite his previous humiliation. "Patrick, Margaret," Samuel said with forced cheerfulness that didn't quite mask his underlying tension. "I hope I'm not intruding, but I have some information that might interest you both." Margaret felt her stomach clench with apprehension. Samuel's timing was suspicious, and his manner suggested that he had learned something that he believed gave him advantage in their previous negotiations. "What kind of information?" Patrick asked warily. Samuel produced a leather portfolio from his saddlebags, his movements carrying the theatrical precision of a lawyer presenting crucial evidence. "I've been making inquiries about Apache trading practices and their legal status within Arizona territory. What I've discovered might change your perspective on certain business relationships." The threat was barely veiled, delivered with the kind of professional courtesy that made it sound like helpful advice rather than intimidation. Margaret realized immediately that Samuel had somehow learned about her father's negotiations with Standing Bear and was attempting to use legal pressure to force her reconsideration of his marriage proposal. The territorial government is becoming increasingly concerned about unauthorized fraternization between white settlers and Apache bands, Samuel continued, spreading documents across the counter with practiced efficiency. Recent legislation includes provisions for investigating trading relationships that might compromise community security or moral standards. Patrick studied the legal documents with growing alarm. The language was complex and deliberately vague, but the implications were clear. Territorial authorities could investigate and potentially criminalize business relationships with Apache traders if they deemed such associations inappropriate or dangerous. Furthermore, Samuel added with the satisfied expression of a man playing his strongest card, there are specific concerns about unmarried white women having contact with Apache men. Such interactions are viewed as particularly threatening to community stability and moral order. Margaret felt her anger building like pressure in a steam boiler, but she forced herself to remain calm while analyzing Samuel's strategy. He was attempting to use legal intimidation to eliminate Standing Bear as an option, thereby forcing her to reconsider marriage to him as the only viable alternative to social disgrace and legal troubles. These regulations, Margaret said with deceptive sweetness, do they apply equally to all citizens, or only to those whose personal choices don't meet with official approval? Samuel's confidence faltered slightly as he recognized the dangerous edge in her voice. The law applies to everyone, Margaret, but it's enforced based on community standards and reported concerns. If certain relationships were to become the subject of official investigation, are you threatening my family with legal harassment, Mr. Davis? Margaret's voice had dropped to the quiet tone that always preceded significant confrontations. I'm offering information that might help you make better decisions about your future, Samuel replied, attempting to maintain his professional demeanor, despite growing awareness that his strategy was not producing the desired results. How considerate of you, Margaret said, rising from her chair with the fluid grace that always preceded decisive action. And I suppose this helpful information comes with renewed offers of marriage and protection from the legal difficulties you've so thoughtfully identified. Samuel's strategy was now completely transparent, and both Patrick and Margaret could see that he was attempting to use territorial law as a weapon to force compliance with his romantic ambitions. But his approach revealed a fundamental misunderstanding of Margaret's character threats, and manipulation had never been effective tools for controlling her behavior. Margaret, be reasonable, Samuel said, abandoning his professional facade as desperation crept into his voice. I'm offering you security, respectability, and protection from exactly the kind of legal troubles that your unconventional associations might create. A woman in your position can't afford to ignore practical realities. A woman in my position, Margaret replied with steel in her voice, can't afford to marry a man who thinks legal intimidation is an appropriate courtship strategy. The confrontation was interrupted by the arrival of Standing Bear himself, whose imposing presence immediately shifted the dynamics in the room. Samuel's confidence evaporated completely as he found himself face to face with the Apache warrior, whose existence he had been using as a legal threat. Mr. O'Sullivan, Standing Bear said with formal courtesy, I came to inform you that I will be departing earlier than planned. Circumstances require that I return to my people tomorrow morning. The news hit Margaret like a physical blow. She had expected 2 days to make her decision, but now she had less than 12 hours to choose between everything familiar and a future she could barely imagine. Why the sudden change? Patrick asked, though his gaze moved meaningfully toward Samuel, suggesting he suspected the lawyer's presence and threats might be connected to Standing Bear's altered timeline. Word has reached me that territorial officials are making inquiries about Apache trading activities. Standing Bear replied, his tone neutral but his eyes reflecting understanding of the political pressures at work. It would be wise for me to conclude my business here and return to my people before such inquiries become more intensive. Samuel shifted uncomfortably, realizing that his legal threats had created exactly the complications he had intended, but that those complications were now forcing the very choice he had hoped to prevent. By accelerating Standing Bear's departure, he had inadvertently increased the pressure on Margaret to make an immediate decision about her future. Miss Margaret, Standing Bear continued, his formal language not quite concealing the personal urgency beneath his words. If you have decided to accept the opportunity we discussed, you would need to be ready to travel at first light. The moment of truth had arrived with shocking suddenness. Margaret stared at Standing Bear, then at her father, then at Samuel, whose legal maneuvering had created a crisis that demanded immediate resolution rather than careful deliberation. "You can't seriously be considering this madness," Samuel said, his professional composure finally cracking under the strain of watching his carefully laid plans backfire spectacularly. "Margaret, you're talking about abandoning civilization, your family, everything decent and proper, to live like a savage in the wilderness." The contempt in his voice when he said savage crystallized something in Margaret's mind. This was exactly the attitude she had been fighting against her entire adult life, the assumption that her choices were valid only if they conformed to other people's definitions of appropriate behavior. "Mr. Davis," she said with icy precision, "your concern for my welfare would be more convincing if it weren't so obviously motivated by wounded pride and legal intimidation. I suggest you return to Tucson and find a woman whose ambitions align more closely with your expectations." Samuel's face flushed red with anger and humiliation. "You'll regret this decision, Margaret. When you're living in squalor among those people, remembering what you could have had as my wife, you'll understand what a mistake you're making." "The only mistake I might make," Margaret replied, "would be allowing fear of your disapproval to prevent me from discovering what I'm actually capable of achieving." After Samuel departed in frustrated defeat, Margaret faced her father in Standing Bear in the trading post that had been the center of her life for 22 years. The familiar space suddenly felt smaller and more constraining than ever before, as if Standing Bear's presence had opened windows that revealed how limited her current world actually was. "Father," she said quietly, "I need to know that if I make this choice, you'll understand that it comes from strength rather than rebellion. I'm not running away from responsibility. I'm running toward the chance to discover what kind of responsibility I'm actually capable of handling." Patrick looked at his daughter with a mixture of pride and terror, recognizing that the woman standing before him had grown beyond his ability to protect or control. The radical solution he had proposed as a desperate gamble had revealed itself as exactly the opportunity Margaret had been unconsciously seeking through all her rejections of conventional alternatives. "I understand," he said finally, though. His voice carried the weight of a father watching his child step into a future he couldn't share or fully comprehend. "And I'm proud of your courage, even if it terrifies me." Standing Bear remained silent during the exchange between father and daughter, understanding that this was a moment requiring space for family bonds to adapt to unprecedented change. When Margaret finally turned to him, her decision was clear in her eyes before she spoke. "I'll be ready at first light," she said simply, the words carrying the weight of choosing transformation over security, adventure over certainty, and the unknown over the familiar constraints that had defined her entire life. The die was cast. By morning, Margaret O'Sullivan would begin a journey that would either destroy her or transform her into something she had never imagined possible. There was no middle ground in the choice she had made, no safe compromise between the life she was leaving and the destiny she was embracing. The point of no return had been reached, and Margaret faced it with the same fearless determination that had characterized her entire adult life. Margaret spent her final night in Copper Ridge methodically packing a single leather satchel with items that might prove useful in a world she had never seen. The process was both practical and emotional. Each choice forced her to decide what aspects of her former life were worth carrying into an uncertain future, and what could be left behind without regret. She folded her simplest dresses, the ones made for work rather than social occasions, knowing that elaborate frontier fashion would be useless among the Apache. Her mother's silver locket went into the bag alongside a small Bible, her father's ledger books that had taught her mathematics and record keeping, and the dime novels that had first opened her imagination to possibilities beyond conventional expectations. At the bottom of the satchel, wrapped carefully in soft cloth, she placed her most treasured possession, a photograph of her mother, taken just months before her death when Margaret was 12. Catherine O'Sullivan had died of fever during a harsh winter, but not before instilling in her daughter the belief that intelligence and courage were gifts to be used rather than hidden. She would have understood, Margaret whispered to the photograph, knowing that her mother's own unconventional spirit had been constrained by circumstances that offered fewer choices than what Margaret now faced as dawn approached. Margaret made her way downstairs to find her father already waiting in the kitchen, coffee prepared and a substantial breakfast laid out despite the early hour. Patrick's eyes were red-rimmed with sleeplessness, but his expression carried resigned acceptance rather than the anger or desperation she had feared. "I've prepared supplies for your journey," he said, gesturing toward a canvas pack filled with jerked beef, dried fruit, and other provisions that would travel well in desert conditions. "And I've written letters of credit that might prove useful if you ever need to establish your identity or access funds in territorial towns." The practical preparations reflected Patrick's business-minded approach to unprecedented situations. But Margaret could see deeper emotions beneath his composed exterior. Her father was losing his daughter, his business partner, and his closest companion all at once, yet he was channeling his grief into ensuring her success rather than trying to prevent her departure. "Father," Margaret said, settling beside him. At the small kitchen table, where they had shared thousands of meals and conversations, "I need you to know that this choice isn't a rejection of everything you've given me. The education, the values, the courage to think for myself, all of it is coming with me." Patrick nodded, unable to trust his voice for several moments. When he finally spoke, his words carried the weight of 22 years of fatherhood, compressed into a single piece of advice. "Your mother always said that the greatest gift we could give you was the strength to choose your own path, even if that path led places we couldn't follow. I'm terrified for you, Margaret, but I'm also proud that you have the courage to seize an opportunity that honors who you truly are." Their farewell breakfast was interrupted by the sound of horses approaching from the direction of town. Margaret felt her stomach clench with apprehension. If word of her departure had somehow leaked, they might face a confrontation that could turn dangerous for everyone involved. But the riders who approached the trading post were Sheriff Bradley and Deputy Collins, their presence suggesting official business rather than social interference. Both men dismounted with the careful movements of lawmen who weren't sure what kind of situation they were entering. "Morning, Patrick, Miss Margaret," Sheriff Bradley said, touching his hat brim politely but keeping his eyes alert for signs of trouble. "We've had reports that the Apache trader is planning to leave earlier than usual, and there are some folks in town who are concerned about irregularities in his recent visit." The careful language indicated that the sheriff was under pressure to investigate Standing Bear's activities, but his tone suggested that he was more interested in avoiding problems than creating them. Margaret realized that Samuel's legal threats had stirred up exactly the kind of official scrutiny that could complicate her departure. "Standing Bear concluded his trading business yesterday," Patrick replied with careful neutrality. "His early departure is his own affair, as far as I'm concerned." Deputy Collins, a younger man whose inexperience showed in his nervous energy, spoke up with less diplomatic restraint. "There's talk in town about unusual associations, Mr. O'Sullivan. Some folks are saying that certain relationships might not be appropriate for unmarried women in this community." The implication was clear, and Margaret felt her temper flare. At the suggestion that her conversations with Standing Bear were somehow improper or dangerous. But she also recognized that losing her composure now could create exactly the kind of incident that might prevent her departure. "Deputy Collins," she said with icy politeness, "I'm curious about what specific laws might govern conversations between a woman and a trading partner who has conducted business here for 3 years without incident." The young deputy's confidence wavered under her direct challenge, and Sheriff Bradley stepped in before the situation could escalate further. "No specific laws have been broken," he said firmly, shooting a warning glance at his deputy. "But the territorial government has asked us to monitor trading relationships for any activities that might compromise community security." Margaret understood that the sheriff was caught between conflicting pressures: official requirements to investigate Apache activities, community concerns about her unconventional behavior, and his own desire to avoid creating problems where none actually existed. "Sheriff Bradley," she said, making a decision that would either resolve the immediate crisis or make it much worse, "I appreciate your concern for community welfare, but I should inform you that I'll be traveling with my father to Phoenix this morning on business matters. We'll be away for an extended period." The lie was delivered with such confident authority that both lawmen accepted it without question. Margaret's reputation for business competence made her involvement in trading expeditions plausible, and her father's quick nod confirmed the story. "That should address any concerns about inappropriate associations," Patrick added with just enough emphasis to make clear that he was aware of the real reasons for their visit. "Margaret will be well chaperoned during our business travels." After the sheriff and deputy departed, Margaret realized that her improvised cover story had created a new problem. If she simply disappeared with Standing Bear, the discrepancy between her claimed destination and her actual departure would eventually be discovered, potentially creating legal troubles for her father. "We need to make it appear that you actually left for Phoenix," Patrick said, reaching the same conclusion. "I'll arrange for witnesses to see you departing in that direction, and I'll send letters to business associates there confirming your expected arrival." The deception was elaborate, but it would provide Patrick with plausible explanations for Margaret's absence, while protecting both of them from accusations of improper associations with Apache traders. More importantly, it would give Margaret time to establish herself among Standing Bear's people before any official inquiries about her whereabouts became serious. As the sun crested the mountains and painted the desert in shades of gold and rose, Margaret made her final preparations for a journey that would transform everything about her life. She changed from her familiar frontier dress into traveling clothes that would be more practical for long days in the saddle, a divided skirt that allowed her to ride astride, a plain cotton blouse, and sturdy boots that could handle rough terrain. Standing Bear arrived exactly when he had promised, his approach silent and commanding as always. He had prepared a second horse for Margaret, a gentle mare whose calm disposition suggested she had been chosen specifically for an inexperienced rider who would need to cover long distances without difficulty. "Are you ready, Miss Margaret?" Standing Bear asked, his formal language not quite concealing the personal significance of the moment. Margaret looked around the trading post that had been her home for 15 years. At the father who had shaped her character and supported her independence, even when it challenged everything he understood about proper behavior, and at the town of Copper Ridge that had never quite known what to do with a woman who refused to accept conventional limitations. "I'm ready," she said, meaning it completely. The farewell between father and daughter was brief but intense, both of them understanding that this might be their final goodbye. Patrick pressed the pack of supplies into her hands, along with a small leather pouch containing gold coins that would provide security in emergency situations. "Write to me when you can," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "Let me know that you're safe and happy." "I will," Margaret promised, though they both knew that communication between Arizona Territory settlements and Apache camps would be difficult and infrequent. As Margaret mounted the mare and adjusted herself in the unfamiliar saddle, she felt a mixture of terror and exhilaration that reminded her of the moment before diving into deep water, the knowledge that there was no turning back once the commitment was made. Standing Bear led the way north from Copper Ridge, following trails that Margaret had never seen, but that he navigated with the confidence of someone who knew every rock and tree in the territory. Behind them, the settlement that had defined Margaret's entire life grew smaller and more distant until it disappeared completely into the desert landscape. For the first time in her 22 years, Margaret O'Sullivan was truly free from expectations, free from limitations, free from the constraining definitions of what a woman could be or accomplish. The freedom was terrifying and wonderful in equal measure, carrying both the promise of unprecedented opportunities and the knowledge that she was entirely responsible for whatever came next. The journey into her new life had begun, and there was no path back to the safety of everything she had left behind. The first day of Margaret's journey into Apache territory tested every assumption she had made about her own physical and mental strength. Standing Bear set a pace that seemed effortless for him, but pushed both Margaret and her mare to their limits, covering ground through terrain that grew increasingly rugged as they moved away from the settled areas around Copper Ridge. By midday, Margaret's muscles ached in ways she had never experienced, and her hands were blistered from gripping the unfamiliar reins. But she refused to ask for rest or special consideration, understanding instinctively that her credibility among Standing Bear's people would depend on proving she could handle hardship without complaint. The mountains were approaching, Standing Bear said during their brief stop at a hidden spring. Mark the boundary between the world you have known and the world you are entering. Beyond that ridge, different laws apply, different customs govern behavior, and different standards determine worth. Margaret studied the imposing peaks that rose before them, their rocky faces carved by wind and weather into formations that seemed both beautiful and forbidding. Somewhere beyond those mountains lay people who might accept her as an equal, or who might find her completely unsuitable for their way of life. "What will happen when we reach your people?" she asked, accepting the water and jerked meat that Standing Bear offered while trying to hide how exhausted the morning's ride had left her. "You will be presented to the Council of Elders as a potential addition to our community," Standing Bear replied. "They will evaluate your character, your abilities, and your willingness to adapt to our ways. Their decision will determine whether you are welcomed as a guest, accepted as a member of our people, or—" He didn't finish the sentence, but Margaret understood the implication. If the Apache elders found her unsuitable, her only option would be the dangerous journey back to Copper Ridge. Assuming Standing Bear was willing to provide safe passage for someone his people had rejected, the afternoon brought new challenges as they climbed narrow trails that hugged cliff faces and crossed streams swollen with mountain runoff. Margaret's mare proved sure-footed and steady, but the exposure to heights and the constant need for concentration left her mentally as well as physically drained. As evening shadows began to lengthen, Standing Bear led them to a sheltered canyon, where water flowed from natural springs and grass provided grazing for their horses. The location was clearly a regular camping spot, marked by the remains of previous fires and evidence of long use by travelers. "We will rest here tonight," Standing Bear announced, beginning to unpack supplies with the efficient movements of someone accustomed to making camp in wilderness conditions. "Tomorrow we will reach my people's winter settlement." Margaret slid down from her mare with a grateful sigh, her legs trembling from hours in the saddle. Every muscle in her body protested the unaccustomed exercise, but she forced herself to help with the camp preparations rather than collapsing in exhaustion. "Let me gather firewood," she offered, needing to contribute despite her fatigue. Standing Bear nodded approvingly. "Choose dry branches that will burn without much smoke. We are still close enough to traveled routes that unnecessary fires might attract unwanted attention." The practical instruction reminded Margaret that they were traveling through territory where Apache movements were monitored by territorial authorities and where discovery could mean serious legal consequences for both of them. Her decision to leave Copper Ridge had created risks that extended far beyond her own personal safety. As they worked together to prepare their simple camp, Margaret became aware of how much she didn't know about survival in wilderness conditions. Every task that Standing Bear accomplished with unconscious competence required careful instruction when she attempted it: building a fire that would burn cleanly, preparing food that would provide maximum nutrition with minimal waste, arranging bedding that would provide warmth and comfort on rocky ground. Among my people, Standing Bear observed as they shared their evening meal, survival skills are learned from childhood. Adults who lack such knowledge are considered incomplete, regardless of what other abilities they might possess. The comment wasn't criticism, but it highlighted one of the many challenges Margaret would face in adapting to Apache life. Her education in reading, writing, and business management would mean nothing if she couldn't master the basic requirements for staying alive in conditions very different from frontier settlements. "Then I'll need to learn quickly," Margaret replied with more confidence than she felt. "What other skills will be considered essential?" Standing Bear's answer revealed the complexity of Apache society and the demanding standards applied to anyone seeking acceptance within it. Women were expected to master not only domestic skills like cooking, sewing, and childcare, but also practical abilities like plant identification, food preservation, and even basic medical knowledge for treating injuries and illnesses. But most importantly, Standing Bear continued, "You will need to demonstrate the qualities of character that we value above all else: courage in facing danger, wisdom in making decisions that affect the community, and loyalty that places the welfare of the people above personal comfort or convenience." As they settled beside their small fire under a canopy of stars, more brilliant than anything Margaret had ever seen from Copper Ridge, she began to understand the magnitude of the transformation she was attempting. This wasn't simply a matter of learning new customs or adapting to different living conditions. It was about fundamentally changing her understanding of what life could be and what she might become. "Standing Bear," she said quietly, "what made you believe I might be capable of succeeding among your people? What did you see in me that suggested I could handle such dramatic changes?" His answer revealed depths of observation and understanding that surprised her. During his trading visits to Copper Ridge, Standing Bear had noticed not just her intelligence and independence, but her responses to stress, her treatment of people from different social positions, and her ability to remain calm during difficult situations. "When Mrs. Patterson's child was lost last winter," he said, "you organized the search party and maintained hope when others had given up. When the Henderson brothers were fighting over water rights, you found a solution that satisfied both families. These actions revealed qualities that would be highly valued among my people." Margaret remembered both incidents, but she had never considered them as demonstrations of leadership ability. In Copper Ridge, her interventions had been seen as inappropriate, meddling in affairs that weren't her concern. The idea that the same behaviors might be valued rather than criticized opened new possibilities for understanding her own capabilities. The second day of their journey brought them into territory that felt completely removed from anything Margaret had ever experienced. The landscape was harsher and more dramatic, with towering red rock formations and deep canyons that seemed to swallow sound and create their own weather patterns. But it was also beautiful in ways that took her breath away. Vast vistas that stretched to distant horizons, rock formations carved into fantastic shapes by wind and water, and a quality of light that made every color more vivid and intense than anything she had known in settled areas. "This land shapes the people who live here," Standing Bear explained as they navigated a particularly challenging section of trail. "It demands strength, adaptability, and respect for forces beyond human control. Those who cannot meet these demands do not survive to pass on their weaknesses." The harsh truth of his words was evident in the unforgiving terrain around them. This was not country that tolerated mistakes or rewarded half-hearted efforts. Everyone who lived here had to prove themselves daily against challenges that would defeat those who lacked sufficient courage or competence. As afternoon faded toward evening, Margaret caught her first glimpse of Standing Bear's people. Smoke from cooking fires rose from a hidden valley, and she could make out the distinctive shapes of traditional Apache dwellings nestled among trees and rock formations that provided natural protection and concealment. "My people call this place Whispering Springs," Standing Bear said, his voice carrying new warmth as they approached his home. "The name comes from the sound the wind makes when it flows through the canyon walls. It has been a winter gathering place for my band for many generations." Margaret felt her pulse quicken with a mixture of excitement and terror. In a few minutes, she would meet the people who would determine whether her radical choice led to a new life of purpose and respect, or to rejection and the dangerous journey back to a world that no longer felt like home. As they descended into the valley, Margaret could see Apache men, women, and children going about their daily activities with the kind of purposeful efficiency that characterized successful communities everywhere. But there was something different here, a quality of alertness and readiness that reflected lives lived in constant awareness of both opportunity and danger. Several people looked up at their approach, their expressions curious but not hostile. Margaret realized that Standing Bear's return with a white woman was probably not entirely unexpected. He would have sent word ahead through the complex communication networks that connected Apache bands across the territory. "Remember," Standing Bear said quietly as they approached the edge of the settlement, "among my people, respect must be earned through demonstrated worth. Your education and background will mean nothing until you prove that you can contribute to our survival and prosperity." Margaret straightened in her saddle, drawing on reserves of courage she hadn't known she possessed. Everything she had been, everything she had accomplished in her previous life, was now irrelevant. What mattered was who she could become among people who valued strength, wisdom, and loyalty above social convention or inherited privilege. The great test of her life was about to begin, and there would be no second chances if she failed to prove herself worthy of the opportunity Standing Bear had offered. But as Margaret looked around at the magnificent landscape and the proud people who had made it their home, she felt a surge of determination that surprised her with its intensity. This was where she belonged. This was where she would discover what she was truly capable of becoming. The scared young woman who had fled Copper Ridge was already disappearing, replaced by someone ready to fight for her place in a world that demanded nothing less than her absolute best. The first person to approach them was an elderly Apache woman whose weathered face and alert eyes suggested both wisdom and authority. She moved with the careful dignity of someone whose age commanded respect, but whose sharp gaze evaluated Margaret with the intensity of a hawk studying potential prey. "Standing Bear," the woman said in heavily accented English, "you have brought us the white woman you spoke of in your message." Margaret felt the weight of that evaluation as the elderly woman, clearly a person of significance within the wire community, studied her from head to toe. Every detail was being noted and judged: her posture in the saddle, the condition of her clothes after 2 days of hard travel, the way she held herself under scrutiny that would have intimidated most frontier women. "Grandmother Silver Moon," Standing Bear replied with deep respect, "I present Margaret O'Sullivan, daughter of the Irish trader, who seeks to learn our ways and prove her worth among our people." The formal introduction marked the beginning of what Margaret would later understand was a carefully orchestrated evaluation process. Grandmother Silver Moon was not just greeting a visitor, she was conducting the first phase of assessment that would determine Margaret's fate among the Apache. "Dismount," Grandmother Silver Moon commanded, her tone carrying absolute authority despite her advanced age. "Let me see how you carry yourself on the ground." Margaret slid down from her mare with as much grace as her aching muscles would allow, forcing herself to stand straight despite the exhaustion that made her want to collapse. She had learned enough about Apache culture during her journey to understand that showing weakness now would be catastrophic for her chances of acceptance. Grandmother Silver Moon walked slowly around Margaret, examining her with the thorough Attention of someone evaluating livestock at a trading post. But there was nothing insulting about the inspection. It was the practical assessment of a leader determining whether a potential new member possessed the physical and mental qualities necessary for survival in their harsh environment. "Your hands," Grandmother Silvermoon said, gesturing for Margaret to extend them. Margaret held out her hands, knowing that the elderly woman would see calluses from years of work at the trading post, but also the blisters and soreness from her recent ride. The examination was conducted in silence while other Apache people gathered at a respectful distance, their expressions suggesting that this initial evaluation was a community event of considerable importance. "Soft hands," Grandmother Silvermoon pronounced finally, "but not weak hands. You have worked, but not in our ways. This will change if you remain among us." A statement carried both criticism and possibility, acknowledgement that Margaret lacked essential skills while suggesting that those skills could be learned if she proved worthy of the investment. Standing Bear spoke quietly to Grandmother Silvermoon in Apache, their rapid conversation including gestures and references that Margaret couldn't follow. She caught her own name several times, along with words that might have referred to her father, Copper Ridge, and the circumstances that had brought her here. "Come," Grandmother Silvermoon said when their discussion concluded. "You will stay in my lodge while the council decides whether you may remain among us. Standing Bear has spoken for your character, but character must be proven through actions, not words." Margaret followed the elderly woman through the settlement, acutely aware that every person they passed was studying her with intense curiosity. Apache children peered at her from behind their mothers' skirts, while men and women engaged in various activities paused to evaluate this unprecedented addition to their community. The lodge that would serve as Margaret's temporary home was larger than she had expected, with space for multiple families and an interior organization that reflected both practical efficiency and cultural traditions she didn't yet understand. Grandmother Silvermoon's status as a senior woman in the community was evident in the quality of the furnishings and the respectful behavior of younger Apache women who came and went. "You will learn our language," Grandmother Silvermoon announced as she showed Margaret to a sleeping area partitioned by hanging rugs. "You will learn our customs. You will learn our skills. If you cannot learn, or if you will not learn, you will leave." The ultimatum was delivered without hostility, but with the kind of absolute certainty that made argument impossible. Margaret was being offered opportunity, but that opportunity came with non-negotiable requirements that would test every aspect of her character and ability. "How long do I have to prove myself?" Margaret asked, setting down her travel bag and trying to project confidence she didn't entirely feel. "The council will observe you for one full cycle of seasons," Grandmother Silvermoon replied. "By next winter, we will know whether you belong among us or whether you should return to your own people." A full year. Margaret felt a mixture of relief and terror at the timeline relief that she wouldn't be judged after just a few days, but terror at the magnitude of change she would need to accomplish in 12 months. "Tomorrow," Grandmother Silvermoon continued, "you begin learning. Laughing Fox will teach you women's work. Running Elk will teach you the language. Walking Deer will teach you the plants and animals that mean survival in this country. Each teacher will report your progress to the council." The intensive educational program was both reassuring and intimidating. Margaret would receive genuine instruction in essential skills, but she would also be under constant evaluation by people whose standards she didn't yet understand. That evening, Margaret experienced her first Apache communal meal, a complex social event that revealed layers of community organization and cultural meaning she couldn't fully grasp. Seating arrangements reflected status and relationships in ways that spoke of sophisticated social hierarchies. Food distribution followed patterns that honored both practical needs and ceremonial significance. Standing Bear sat with the men of warrior age, participating in discussions that were conducted primarily in Apache but occasionally shifted to English when topics relevant to trading relationships with white settlements arose. Margaret could see that his status within the community was substantial. Other men listened to his opinions with respect, and his presence at the council circle suggested significant influence in decision-making processes. Margaret found herself seated among the women, where conversation flowed around her in Apache while she struggled to identify even basic words or phrases. The isolation was profound, surrounded by people, but unable to participate in the most fundamental form of human connection. Laughing Fox, a woman perhaps 10 years older than Margaret, seemed to have been assigned as her primary guide and instructor. She spoke reasonable English and demonstrated admirable patience in explaining customs and expectations that Margaret needed to understand immediately. Among our people, Laughing Fox explained quietly, women hold positions of great importance. But those positions must be earned through demonstrated competence. No woman receives respect simply because she was born to it or married into it. The contrast with frontier society was stark and appealing. Margaret had grown up watching women defer to male authority regardless of their own abilities or accomplishments. The idea of a society where women earn status through their own merits rather than their relationships to men offered exactly the kind of opportunity she had been seeking. What kinds of competence are most valued? Margaret asked, trying to understand the standards by which she would be judged. Skill in women's work, cooking, sewing, plant gathering, childcare, Laughing Fox replied. But also wisdom and counsel, courage in danger, and the ability to make decisions that benefit the whole community rather than just yourself. The requirements were demanding but fair, emphasizing both practical abilities and character traits that Margaret had always possessed but never been able to fully develop within the constraints of frontier society. As the evening progressed, Margaret began to understand that her period of evaluation would involve much more than simply learning new skills. She would need to demonstrate that she could think like an Apache, placing community welfare above personal comfort and making decisions based on collective benefit rather than individual preference. The test came sooner than she had expected. During the night, a child in the settlement became seriously ill with a fever that alarmed the experienced Apache women. Margaret was awakened by the commotion and found herself in the midst of a medical crisis that required immediate action. "The child needs cooling," she said in English to Laughing Fox, drawing on knowledge she had gained helping Dr. Peterson during various medical emergencies in Copper Ridge. Cold water on the forehead and wrists, but not so much that she becomes chilled. Her suggestion was translated to Grandmother Silver Moon, who was directing the treatment efforts with the authority of someone experienced in dealing with childhood illnesses. The elderly woman's expression suggested skepticism about medical advice from an untested outsider, but she was also practical enough to consider any suggestion that might help a sick child. "Show us," Grandmother Silver Moon commanded. Margaret found herself in charge of cooling treatments for a desperately ill Apache child whose life might depend on her medical knowledge and practical skills. The responsibility was terrifying, but it was also exactly the kind of situation where she could prove her value to the community in terms they would understand and respect. Working through the night alongside Apache women whose competence she was only beginning to appreciate, Margaret demonstrated not just practical medical knowledge, but the kind of calm decision-making under pressure that Apache culture valued highly. When the child's fever finally broke near dawn, Margaret had earned something more valuable than approval. She had earned a place in the community's memory as someone who could be trusted in crisis situations. "You have healing knowledge, Grandmother," Silver Moon observed as the crisis passed and the child settled into peaceful sleep. "This is useful to our people." The comment was delivered with characteristic Apache understatement, but Margaret understood that she had passed her first major test. More importantly, she had discovered that her education and experience in Copper Ridge had provided her with skills that could translate directly into value within Apache Society. As the community settled back into normal routines after the medical emergency, Margaret realized that her year of evaluation had truly begun. Every day would bring new challenges and opportunities to prove herself worthy of the extraordinary opportunity Standing Bear had offered. The scared young woman who had fled Copper Ridge was disappearing, replaced by someone discovering capabilities she had never known she possessed. The transformation was just beginning, but already Margaret could feel herself becoming someone who might truly belong among people who valued strength, wisdom, and the courage to face any challenge that threatened their community's survival. Months had passed since Margaret O'Sullivan first entered the Apache settlement at Whispering Springs, and the woman who now sat in the council circle bore little resemblance to the frightened frontier merchant's daughter who had fled Copper Ridge. Her auburn hair was now braided with silver ornaments that marked her growing status within the Maida community. Her hands bore the calluses of mastering skills essential for Apache survival, and her green eyes held the confident gaze of someone who had proven herself worthy of respect among people who granted it only through demonstrated merit. The council meeting that would determine her permanent fate had been called for the night of the autumn harvest celebration, when the full cycle of seasons she had been granted for proving herself would officially conclude. Margaret sat with perfect composure as Standing Bear addressed the assembled elders, recounting her achievements and contributions over the past year in the formal language required for such momentous decisions. The woman known among us as Green Eyes, who sees far, has mastered our language with remarkable speed. Standing Bear reported to the circle of weathered faces that represented generations of Apache wisdom and leadership. She speaks now with fluency that allows her to participate fully in our councils and ceremonies. The language achievement alone was extraordinary. Most outsiders who attempted to learn Apache struggled for years to achieve basic communication. But Margaret's natural intelligence and desperate motivation had driven her to fluency in less than 6 months. More importantly, she had learned not just words, but the cultural concepts and ceremonial forms that marked true understanding of Apache thought. Grandmother Silver Moon, now recognized as Margaret's primary sponsor and advocate, spoke next with the authority that her age and wisdom commanded within the community. Green Eyes, who sees far, has proven herself in every aspect of women's work that we require, the elderly leader announced. Her skills in healing have saved 3 lives this year, including the life of my own grandson during the fever sickness that claimed children in other bands. Her knowledge of plants and medicines exceeds that of women twice her age. The medical abilities that Margaret had demonstrated during her first night in the settlement had developed into genuine expertise under the tutelage of Apache healers who possessed knowledge passed down through countless generations. She had learned to identify healing plants, prepare medicines, and treat injuries with skills that complemented her previous experience helping frontier doctors. But it was Running Elk, the war leader whose initial skepticism about accepting a white woman had gradually transformed into grudging respect, who delivered the most significant testimony. Green Eyes, who sees far, has shown courage that honors our people, he declared, his weathered face reflecting memories of the events that had truly tested Margaret's character. When the Mexican raiders threatened our horse herds she rode with our warriors and fought with the skill and bravery of someone born to our ways. The raid had occurred 3 months earlier, when a band of Mexican outlaws had attempted to steal Apache horses under cover of darkness. Margaret had awakened to the sounds of conflict and without hesitation armed herself and joined the defense of the settlement. Her accurate shooting and calm behavior under fire had helped drive off the raiders while earning the respect of Apache warriors who had initially doubted whether any white person could truly understand their ways. She has proven herself not just as a woman who can contribute to our survival, Running Elk continued, but as a warrior who will fight to protect what we have built together. Chief Gray Wolf, the eldest member of the council whose word carried final authority in all major decisions, Listen to each testimony with the careful attention of someone who understood that this choice would set precedents affecting the community's future relationship with the white world that pressed ever closer to their traditional territories. The woman Green Eyes who sees far has indeed proven herself worthy of full acceptance among our people, Chief Gray Wolf pronounced finally, his voice carrying the weight of absolute decision. But her achievements have earned her more than simple membership in our band. Margaret felt her heart stop as the chief's words took an unexpected direction. She had hoped for acceptance, prayed for the opportunity to remain permanently among people who had become her chosen family. She had not anticipated anything beyond the chance to continue the life she had been building. Green Eyes who sees far possesses qualities of leadership that our people will need in the changing times ahead, Chief Gray Wolf continued. Her understanding of both our ways and the ways of the white world makes her uniquely valuable as we navigate the challenges of preserving our culture while adapting to new realities. Standing Bear's expression revealed that he too was surprised by the direction of the chief's pronouncement. Margaret realized that the council had been discussing possibilities far beyond what she had imagined during her year of proving herself. Therefore, Chief Gray Wolf announced with ceremonial formality, "It is the decision of this council that Green Eyes who sees far be granted not only full membership in our band, but elevation to the status of leader among women with authority, to speak in council and guide our people in matters requiring her unique knowledge and wisdom." The pronouncement sent ripples of amazement through the assembled community. Margaret was not just being accepted, she was being offered a position of genuine leadership and authority within Apache society, something that would have been absolutely impossible for any woman in the white world she had abandoned. But Chief Gray Wolf was not finished with announcements that would reshape Margaret's understanding of her place among the Apache. Furthermore, the chief continued, Standing Bear has petitioned this council for permission to offer marriage to Green Eyes who sees far. According to our customs and traditions, the council grants this permission, but the choice belongs to the woman herself, as is proper among our people. Margaret turned to look at Standing Bear, seeing in his dark eyes the same mixture of hope and vulnerability that she had felt throughout her year of proving herself worthy of Apache acceptance. The marriage proposal was not unexpected. Their attraction to each other had been evident from their first conversations in Copper Ridge, but the timing and formal nature of the offer carried significance that extended far beyond personal feelings. "Standing Bear," she said, rising from her place in the council circle with the grace that 10 months of Apache training had taught her. "When you first offered me the chance to learn your people's ways, you promised that I would have genuine choice about my future. That promise has been kept in ways that exceed anything I could have imagined." She paused, looking around the circle of faces that had become as familiar and dear to her as her father's had once been. These people had tested her, taught her, and ultimately accepted her not because of charity or tolerance, but because she had proven herself worthy of the respect they granted only to those who earned it through demonstrated worth. "In my former life," Margaret continued, "I rejected marriage proposals from men who saw me as an acquisition rather than a partner, who wanted to diminish my capabilities rather than develop them. Standing Bear has offered me something entirely different, partnership based on mutual respect and shared commitment to our people's welfare." The formal language was appropriate for the ceremonial nature of the moment, but Margaret's emotions ran deeper than any words could express. Standing Bear represented not just personal love, but the validation of everything she had discovered about herself during her transformation from frontier merchant's daughter to Apache leader. "I accept Standing Bear's proposal," she announced, "and I accept the responsibilities of leadership that this council has offered me. I pledge my life to the welfare of our people and the preservation of our ways." The celebration that followed Margaret's acceptance lasted through the night and into the following day, with ceremonies that formally recognized both her new status as a leader among Apache women and her upcoming marriage to Standing Bear. The rituals were complex and beautiful, involving songs, dances, and symbolic exchanges that marked her complete transformation from outsider to central figure in the community's future. But the most meaningful moment came when Grandmother Silver Moon presented Margaret with a necklace of silver and turquoise that had belonged to her own grandmother, a legendary Apache woman whose wisdom and courage had guided her people through the dangerous early years of contact with white settlers. "You are no longer the white woman who came to us seeking shelter," Grandmother Silver Moon said as she placed the ancestral necklace around Margaret's neck. "You are Green Eyes who sees far, daughter of our people, leader among women, and guardian of our future." As the sun set over the mountains that surrounded Whispering Springs, Margaret stood beside Standing Bear, watching their people celebrate not just a marriage but the emergence of leadership that would help the Apache navigate the changing world ahead. Her journey from rejected bride to Apache queen was complete, but she understood that her real work was just beginning. In Copper Ridge, Patrick O'Sullivan received occasional letters that reached him through the complex network of traders and travelers who moved between white settlements and Apache territories. The woman who wrote those letters signed them, Green Eyes who sees far, but her father recognized the unmistakable intelligence and spirit of his daughter Margaret in every carefully chosen word. The letters spoke of a life of purpose and respect that exceeded anything she could have achieved in frontier society, of contributions valued by people who measured worth through capability rather than convention, and of happiness found through embracing challenges rather than avoiding them. Margaret O'Sullivan had disappeared forever, but Green Eyes who sees far had been born from that disappearance, a queen among a proud people, a leader whose unique position between two worlds would help her adopted family thrive in times of unprecedented change. The angry father's punishment had become his daughter's greatest gift, transforming rebellion into leadership and creating a legacy that would endure long after both their names were forgotten. Sometimes the most desperate gambles produced the most extraordinary victories, and sometimes being cast out was the first step toward finding where you truly belonged. In the end, Margaret had found what she had been seeking all along, a place where her strength was valued, her intelligence respected, and her courage rewarded with the kind of partnership and purpose that made every sacrifice worthwhile. She had become a queen not through birth or marriage, but through the ancient Apache way of earning respect through demonstrated worth, and that, she knew as she watched the stars emerge over her mountain home, was the only kind of royalty that truly mattered. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.